Dunya is Falcha. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Justice Subcommittee on Policing 7th meeting of 2020. We have no apologies. Agenda item 1 is a decision in taking business in private. That's the business to review today's evidence. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. Our second item is an evidence session on policing during the coronavirus pandemic. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome Ian Livingston, Chief Constable of Police Scotland, to the meeting, and I invite the Chief Constable to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, committee members. Thank you for the chance just to say a few comments in support of the written paper that we have submitted. In my view, the policing of the pandemic by the Police Service of Scotland will be assessed against 3 broad areas that have remained constant throughout this extraordinary period, namely how the work of our officers and staff to support physical distancing contributes in some way to reduce the spread of the virus and thus protect life. Secondly, whether through our actions we can maintain, possibly even enhance, the very strong relationship of trust that policing has with the public of Scotland. And thirdly, that in doing this, we are able to protect the health, the welfare, the safety of all officers and staff, and importantly, their families. Convener, it's been said regularly, but it does merit repetition that this really is an extraordinary time and an extraordinary period. Policing has been asked, often with extremely short notice, to take on responsibilities to support highly restrictive measures on personal freedoms of movement and association, which have never been seen before. Officers and staff have been very vulnerable in their communities, and there has been remarkable high levels of interaction with the public, with a small number resulting in enforcement thereafter. But I also know that lockdown hasn't affected everyone in the same way. I've repeatedly expressed my concern and compassion for young people in particular who have faced significant restrictions at such an important time of their lives, with many important milestones. And those from our most deprived communities have, for a number of complex reasons, often found it more difficult to comply with the restrictions. And it has been important to fully understand the challenges the pandemic has presented for disabled people and the exemptions that have been built in to the regulations. And as I've said a number of times, supporting those at additional risk who are at home or online has also been a significant concern and priority during this period. What has been encouraging to see is that initial feedback indicates public confidence in policing has actually grown during this time. As Chief Constable and as a service, we will always value the bond of trust with our fellow citizens. It is the consent of the public from which policing obtains its legitimacy. Now, that public confidence, trust and consent that exists, Convener, is down to the work of officers and staff, who, as well as responding to other significant and critical policing demands, have acted with tact, discretion and good sense to police their fellow citizens. And I publicly would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my gratitude and regard for the commitment to public service and well-being that officers and staff have demonstrated. As Chief Constable, I seek at all times to support officers and staff. As a service, we've made changes to the way we work, which in normal circumstances would probably have taken far longer to implement. Now, whether that's been quickly providing operational guidance after a change in the regulations, whether it's making additional necessary deployments to support presence right across parts of Scotland, particularly when a localised lockdown may have been introduced, establishing a dedicated programme to source personal protective equipment and thereafter providing it on a 24-hour basis with appropriate training, or supplying new technology such as we're using here to allow more flexible working and physical distancing. In all these areas, the service has responded quickly, consistently and with composure, as well as having a key role to support broader national coordination. Now, in all of this, in my view, we have been greatly assisted by the fact that we operate as a single police service. But of course, throughout this response, I've said a number of times, and I will acknowledge it today again, Convener, if I may, that policing won't get everything right. We don't get everything right. Mistakes can be made. Mistakes will be made. Mistakes have been made. But when that happens, we will acknowledge them and we'll seek to take appropriate action to rectify that. In closing, Convener, if I may, I'd like to thank everyone who's assisted the Police Service of Scotland during this difficult time. The additional external scrutiny of John Scott's QC's Independent Advisory Group, Scottish Police Authority, HMICS, and this very committee, Convener, have all provided support and challenge, ensuring the Police Service of Scotland discharge their duties consistently and fairly. Statutory bodies, the Scottish Police Federation and other associations and unions have all helped the operational response and helped to develop guidance and procedures to keep the public and keep our people as safe as possible. And crucially, vitally, my final point is that the vast majority of the public have stepped forward and taken personal responsibility, providing the cooperation and support for the police service that was required during this public health emergency. As Chief Constable, I've been and remain hugely grateful for the commitment and forbearance of the people of Scotland, who we as a police service are here to serve and to keep safe. Thank you for the opportunity to make those brief introductory remarks, Convener.
Thank you very much indeed, Chief Constable. Thank you too for the written submission from Police Scotland, and we also thank the other bodies that have submitted evidence to us. That's, as always, very helpful. We're now, Chief Constable, going to move to a series of questions. You've given a comprehensive opening there, and there's a range of questions. I want to start by asking how Police Scotland gives effect to the extremely wide-ranging powers that they've been given, and how changes to these powers have affected how Police Scotland's gone about their business, please.
Thanks, Convener. I think right at the outset, this goes back to maybe the 20th or the 21st of March, after a COBRA chaired by the Prime Minister, the First Minister attended. We were asked to support the closure of the pubs. You might recall that Friday night and that first weekend. And then regulations actually didn't come into place for about 6 or 7 days later. But really right at that opening position of the lockdown, of the restrictions being introduced, I said that we as a service would use common sense, we'd work with the public to support them, to make them, to help them understand the reasons behind these remarkable restrictions on personal liberty, and that we would do it in a way that we would encourage and we would explain the reasons that lay behind these restrictions on association and on movement. So right from that outset period, really, in late March of this year, while the regulations have changed, while easements have changed, while at times there's been a divergence across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, while at times there's been localised divergence, as we've seen recently in Aberdeen, the overall approach and philosophy of policing hasn't. It's remained one of engaging with the public, seeking their support, seeking to support them in return, and where necessary, taking enforcement action. But it's been founded on common sense, police officer discretion to work locally with the communities that they know, and applying a consistent and composed approach to try and help the country get through this really difficult time. There's one final point I would make in closing, if I can, Convener, is that I think we're on to about our 14th or 15th different set of regulations that we've needed collectively to interpret and apply. So, I know how confusing it can be for the police service and for our own officers and staff, far less members of the public. So, and those changes have been necessary. I'm not questioning that, and I'm no way thinking that it's anything other than what should have been done. But it means that it has been at times, people have been inevitably maybe a bit confused about what was expected or what was required, and therefore that's why policing's had to exercise discretion and support the implementation of the restrictions, but do it in a manner that supported the people of Scotland, where enforcement would be taken as a last resort.
Thank you for that, Chief Constable. The Police Committee would assume that Police Scotland would have some input to the updating or amending of any of these emergency powers. Can you outline the level of input you've had and perhaps let us know of any specific changes that have been suggested by Police Scotland, please?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, you're absolutely right. I personally probably have contact either with ministers or senior officials, if not on a daily basis. Certainly in the early days and weeks it was daily, often multiple times in a day. But my own team is literally daily, the liaison, the conversations, the formal meetings, the consultation and the engagement. And again, I have to say that's improved over the piece. I think in the early days the challenge was phenomenal, and the ability to reach out, perhaps inevitably at a time of immediate emergency, was challenging. But we let in. We don't necessarily always wait for people to come to us. We as a service know that we can provide advice, and there's experience there amongst the service. So in the course of that, there's been a number of instances where proposed changes have been discussed. For example, I think the reopening of the hospitality industry. This was an issue that was being aligned again on the, if you like, on the Four Nations basis. And we thought we could understand the reasons for it, about the pubs and restaurants wanting to reopen, but we didn't think reopening on a busy Saturday in summer was possibly the best thing to do. Now that happened in England and Wales, but the Scottish Government, I think, listened to very practical and pragmatic advice from us, and therefore moved the reopening, I think, later in the week to Wednesday. And then in the whole host of changes that have been made, what we have been able to do, I think, has been able to make sure that the proposals that come forward from public health officials for the public health objectives that we all seek are also put through a filter and a lens of achievability and common sense. And again, we've also benefited from some of the work of behavioural psychologists about how people are likely to react. And of course, when you get breaches by people in senior positions of authority, that massively undermines the common purpose and the common good. So we've been involved on a regular basis. I think the First Minister, as we speak, may be announcing further changes regarding house parties and other matters. And again, my colleagues were involved in discussions late last night, and again first thing this morning. I've been involved this morning as well, as those proposals get firmed up. But it's moved extremely quickly. That's why I think it is relevant to talk about the number of changes that have been made. But the police service has been in there providing, I think, professional, composed, practical advice, but recognising that ultimately it's a matter for Parliament to legislate, and parliamentary decisions, we will always uphold them and take them forward. But I do think our voice has been heard during this difficult time.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Chief Constable. Our next questions are from Liam MacArthur. Liam.
Thanks, Convener, and good afternoon, Chief Constable. Just following on from that line of question, I think you explained very well the way in which Police Scotland has been involved in evolving the decision-making policy. You've indicated instances where the advice you've taken has had an impact in terms of the timing of decisions being taken. But are there any concerns that you've had about the way in which we've moved through the route map, either in terms of particular sectors or the timing of changes, and looking ahead to the move towards phase 4? Is there any proactive work that Police Scotland's involved in identifying the challenges that will inevitably come as they've come with the previous easing of restrictions, that maybe will better equip you and your officers to deal with that, but also help the public to understand that process and be compliant where appropriate?
Thank you, Mr. MacArthur. I think in the early days, where there was real clarity on what the message was, stay at home unless there are extraordinary circumstances, and there was consistency across the United Kingdom in terms of broadcast from national media, Scottish media, and elected leaders and others. I think that it was an easier position, if you like, for the service to then to go and work with communities around. Inevitably, and I think everybody recognised this, when the easements began, and there was divergence for an entirely legitimate reason, either between different parts of the United Kingdom, or at times, as we've seen recently, even within different localities of the different jurisdictions. That, I think, has added to some of the challenges and some of the movement. So the Aberdeen lockdown was a good example where, did it extend to the Shire, as they talk about in the North East, and the city and the Shire being so dependent, so many people who work in Aberdeen live in Inverurie, Ellon, Kemney, places such as that. So that required us to have a clear understanding of what was being asked, and also required us to try and help members of the public and businesses. So when the hospitality trade started to reopen, we knew that was happening. We knew the proposed route map, we knew the indicative times, and just exactly as you suggest, we didn't wait for them to open and then go around to check up or to give some advice. We had officers right across the whole of the country going in, working with licensees, working with owners, and working with local licensing boards and colleagues in local authorities to try to provide that level of advice and support. And as we go forward, I think there was always a recognition, and I said, I think, when I appeared before, the policing role, as more people come back into society, as there is a sense of greater normality in terms of work, social life, social engagement, inevitably, we see ourselves, and we have experienced that, of reverting to some of our core policing challenges as society starts to regain its normal patterns of behaviour and interactions, and therefore our enforcement element regarding the COVID public health response would reduce, but it would never ever be eliminated. And in any event, I firmly believe that policing is always far more than simply an enforcement mechanism. I may have said to you before, Mr. MacArthur, my title is I'm the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Scotland, not the Chief Constable of the Law Enforcement Service of Scotland. So policing has always had a far greater role in maintaining community cohesion, community welfare, well-being. It's in our statutory purpose, but it actually goes to the core of what policing is about. We will take enforcement when required, but if we can get ahead of things and support a preventative measures, if we can get ahead of things to help people understand what's been asked of them and why, that this is about public health imperatives, not criminal justice sanctions, that's a better way to do our business. So it's consistent with how I want the Police Service of Scotland to develop. It's based on a lot of our traditions of policing in Scotland, and I think that's where we've been able to be. So we do look ahead. We will go and engage with different sectors, and again allow that that those principles of prevention and early identification and support, they're far better things to do than coming along later with some enforcement measures.
That's helpful. I mean, in your mind, is there a clear public understanding of what is covered by legislation, what's covered by guidance, and therefore the extent to which any enforcement can be carried out by your officers, as opposed to the kind of information, the guidance, the persuasion that you've talked about? Do you think there is a clear understanding there, and what steps have you been taking to try and clarify that with the public, with businesses, etc.?
I think implicit in your observation is a really fair point. That there has been talk on, follow the rules. There has been talk about doing the right thing, and at times, what sat in guidance and what sat in regulation wasn't always clear. And indeed, when I said in my introductory remarks that we haven't always got everything right, and even within the service, in good faith, some of our officers, in a tiny minority, a handful of cases, have issued fixed penalties, which on review by sergeants and by supervisory officers have said, well, actually that's a breach of the guidance, but it's not a breach of the regulations, and we've withdrawn those fixed penalties. So I think your observation about the ability to distinguish between regulations and guidance is a fair one. We've tried to be extremely clear that actually it is encouraging people to do the right thing. Some of them, that encouragement might actually be around seeking to comply with what's been identified as guidance. I think the 5 mile issue a number of weeks back was a case in point, where actually somebody going beyond 5 miles for exercise, that wouldn't generate the issue of a fixed penalty, but it was still the right thing not to go beyond your local area, in essence, to try and stop the spread of the virus. So I don't have an absolute sort of clear answer to your point, other than to acknowledge it, that it has been a challenge. That it's a factor of this unique set of circumstances that we've been in. But it does underline to me that, again, we haven't been overly focused on enforcement and taking a transactional approach to dealing with the public health emergency. We see ourselves as there to encourage everybody to do the right thing as part of the collective response. And we've worked really, really hard to get consistent messaging. We've aligned ourselves at various times with other agencies, and obviously we work very closely with the Scottish Government in that regard as well. But I think there is a legitimacy in the points you make in your question.
Thanks very much. If I could just finally turn to the issue of the tracing system under the quarantine orders. You'll be aware the Justice Secretary was before the Health Committee earlier this week, and there appears to be disparity between the numbers identified by Public Health Scotland, around 700 people needing quarantine and selected spot checks, as compared to the numbers I think identified by Police Scotland under the Travel Regs reports, which was less than 2 dozen. Is that a concern that you've been raising with Scottish Government, with Public Health Scotland? Can we expect a resolution to that, so that the numbers seem to become more into alignment and the public can have confidence in this tracing process?
The quarantine arrangements, I think, have been problematic. I think, as you know, as a matter of public record, it took Public Health Scotland a number of weeks to set up an appropriate process with Border Force. So that's the starting point, people arriving at points, international points of entry to the United Kingdom, the recording requirements that are done there, and then the monitoring requirement of that vesting in Public Health Scotland. Now, in the early weeks of that, for reasons that Public Health Scotland had, we were not passed any information. It was felt that this was sort of personal health information, I suppose, and for reasons of confidentiality, that information wasn't passed to us. So the direct referral from Public Health Scotland has actually only started the early part of this month as we go forward. And you're right, the number of enforcement actions on the part of Police Scotland has been relatively low. Now, that's consistent with what we see across other parts of the United Kingdom as well. It was very much policing was seen as the backstop to this quarantine requirement. The primary function, the primary purpose was self-regulation, people doing the right thing, monitored initially through Border Force and then to Public Health Scotland. So I think those processes have improved, but they were slow to get off and running, not anything that sat with us. And we've now sort of come into play in the last number of weeks. And of course, back to messaging again, for legitimate reasons. When the number of specified countries change, sometimes at short notice, that again causes a degree of difficulty and confusion. But our approach will always be to seek to explain to people what's been asked of them, or if people actually haven't realised that the particular country that they're back from has actually is now one that requires quarantine. So the processes have improved, but it did take a little bit of time to get them up and running.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Our next series of questions are from James Kelly. James?
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, Chief Constable. As society's opened back up again, we've seen a number of local outbreaks. How have Police Scotland responded to those in the immediate sort of short term, and what lessons have you learned as these outbreaks have developed?
Good afternoon, Mr. Kelly. Thanks for your question. The easements and the changes have altered. The public expectation has altered public behaviours, and everybody welcomed the greater freedoms that came with that, and allowing to see your grandchildren, see your wider family and friends and everything that came from that. And again, we started to see greater movement. Everybody will have seen the roads got busier, public spaces got busier at times, causing us challenges when the weather was good. And then when you get a specific spike or a cluster, as using the public health language, whether it's round about the Dumfries and Galloway area, whether it was up recently in Cooper Angus on the back of the chicken factory, whether it was to do with the city of Aberdeen. That's difficult because you're asking people in effect to sort of roll back the way, as it were, because people are getting used to those greater freedoms, and then we're saying, no, you can't go out now. The country requires you to go back to a greater sense of lockdown. So the policing approach has been, again, as I said at the outset, has been consistent. We've stayed with that approach, working with the communities, of engaging with people, of explaining the reasons behind it, working with local authorities, working with other key partners who have been central to the public health response. Incident management teams, locally based, have been established, and we've participated in them with the local commanders and the people who know that area, leading in regard to what was required. Because in each of the different areas, I've named three just in that response to yourself, Mr. Kelly. The circumstances are different. As you know, with the Dumfries and Galloway one, there was a sense that there was a hospital over the border, and how did that link in? In the Cooper Angus one, there was some very specific issues regarding the agricultural industry, the nature of the people who worked there, a number of them who had different jobs, and their contacts and whatnot, and all of that required a localised approach. And then you had Aberdeen, where the whole city was back in lockdown, and as I mentioned earlier, the relationships that the Aberdeen Shire has, just in terms of people's lives, So what we've done in Police Scotland, where local commanders have needed additional resource, because we're a single service, we've provided that, and we've put more officers into communities, onto the ground as required. We've made sure that any support regarding public communications, that we've enhanced that. Any support regarding specialist capability, it was made available, but always tailored to the local needs and the local requirements, and always in a consistent manner with the approach that I was absolutely determined that policing would have in Scotland, which was one of support, policing by consent, common sense, and looking to help communities rather than impose any restrictions.
Thanks for that, Chief Constable. Could I just ask about public attendance at sporting events? There's a test event going to take place tomorrow night at Murrayfield, a rugby match between Glasgow and Edinburgh. It's been reported that a similar test event at Celtic Park between Celtic and Motherwell on Sunday isn't going to go ahead with public attendance. Did Police Scotland provide any advice to the government in regard to these decisions?
No, I haven't had any discussions, Mr. Kelly, in regard to that. We had a number of discussions in terms of the roadmap about the reintroduction of professional sport, and we knew there would be critical incidents because the impact, as you know as well as I, on significant specific matches. Rangers Aberdeen opening game, that's an intense rivalry that without having supporters there, inevitably might have a displacement, and the supporters being elsewhere, or when a season starts, the unfurling of the championship flag, as it happened at Celtic Park and whatnot. But we'd had a number of discussions then, and again we tried to work supporters group and others to discourage people attending outside grounds. You've seen that elsewhere, saw it in Liverpool, saw it internationally in Paris and other places recently in terms of some of the European games. But we haven't had that in Scotland. Again, I think to pay tribute to everybody who's followed good sense, and the pubs have played a part in that as well. You've heard people such as Professor Jason Leach speaking on sports programmes and trying to get the communication message as broad as possible. But we certainly didn't suggest that and I personally did not suggest that they shouldn't start to experiment with football going forward. I think these were based on a public health assessment as opposed to a policing assessment.
Thank you. Any further questions, James?
No further questions, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Our next question is from Rona Mackay. Rona, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Chief Constable. In your opening statement, you spoke of the extra responsibility to adapt policing to the needs of people with vulnerable people with additional support needs. And can you say whether this adaptation and way of working will be continued when we're free of COVID? And on a separate issue, there were press reports last week regarding comments from some that officers were effectively thrown to the wolves during the pandemic and that they felt abandoned and had little support from government. I wonder if you could comment on both those issues, please.
Good afternoon, Ms Mackay. Thank you for both those questions. On the first question, I think what the pandemic threw into spotlight was something that I think we all know, but I think it became very noticeable. That a number of people, particularly with disabilities, with hidden disabilities, one doesn't always know when you see an individual, for example, not wearing a face mask in a shop. But actually there might be very legitimate reasons for that, everything from being asthmatic to suffering from epilepsy or some other condition. So I do think one of the learning points from the policing of the pandemic has been something that, again, we would always seek to do in policing. We're doing it in how we deal with our calls. We do it with the philosophy I was explaining earlier about using common sense, working with people, realising that everybody is different, that the families are different, that individuals have different circumstances, and making sure that we engage with people first and we listen to them and we speak to them and we understand some reasons that some of the behaviours may have manifested themselves, and that we don't rush into an early conclusion. So we had some really helpful inputs from autism support groups, had some really helpful inputs from the Children's Commissioner and other people regarding young people. So it's an issue for people who either have a disability or have a condition or have a particular profile that at times will mean they're going to act or behave in a way that you wouldn't necessarily know or expect. So we will try and sustain that going forward. I do think it's part of the overall approach to listening to communities, to working with individuals, realising that everybody's got their own challenges. And it's been at the heart of my approach, is to encourage people, again, to listen and engage. Don't immediately walk in and issue a fixed penalty to somebody who's not wearing a face mask, because there actually might be a very good reason for that. And by and large, overwhelmingly, that's what our officers and staff do, because that's what they want to do. I don't want any foolish performance matrices expecting individuals to issue X number of fixed penalties or X number of this or that. Don't think that's the way police Scotland, and it's not something that rests with my personal outlook or the values I think that the policing has. So I want people to go and engage, listen to people, understand them, and if enforcement's needed, they'll take enforcement. We have definitely learned from this quite extraordinary time. I think in regard to the sense of officers being abandoned, I think this was a letter that Scottish Police Federation wrote in the early days and weeks of the pandemic. I think actually it was early days. I don't think policing has been abandoned. I think the comments that were made at the time underlined the anxiety that officers and staff were feeling. I think the Scottish Police Federation, rightly and very robustly at times, as members of this committee will know, represent the views of the Federation and the right to do that. I think there were challenges regarding the obtaining and issuing of PPE, but policing wasn't alone in that. Scotland wasn't alone in that. This was a worldwide challenge that we had, and actually I think the police service has actually done remarkably well with the support of the Federation, with the support of our health and safety colleagues. And again, I think in my written report I underline the fact that we've got something like 15,000 officers and staff now issued with full PPE equipment. Our absence is at an all-time record low since Police Scotland came into being, which again underlines the level of commitment that police officers and police staff have brought to their duties. And I do think some of the public narrative around the key role policing has to play, I think, has developed as well. So I don't think policing was abandoned. I think there was a lot of anxiety, not only in the country, but within the police service in the early days and weeks. But I think a lot of that anxiety has now dissipated, and there's a realisation that actually policing has a key role to play. And I always said, actually, in terms of the NHS, protect the NHS. At times there wasn't an awful lot the NHS could do for itself, because it was in that response mode. It was the people who could help the NHS, and in the absence at that time of a robust testing regime, in the absence of a clear vaccine, actually social distancing was the only thing that we as a country could do, and people who could contribute to that were the police service in terms of encouraging the public. So we did have a crucial key role, and I think that has been acknowledged. And I think there was anxiety about the issue of equipment that existed right across the whole of the country and beyond. I hope that a lot of that anxiety has dissipated. But I always listen to the concerns of the Federation. But I don't think policing was abandoned.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Our next questions are from the Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell. Margaret.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good afternoon, Chief Constable. To follow up on Rona Mackay's question, SPF have issued certain correspondence she's referred to. They've also issued a submission to the committee. Their correspondence mentioned feeling abandoned at early stages of lockdown. You covered that. But their submission very much covers concerns here and now. And it includes concerns about the lack of acknowledgement of the conflicting pressures of childcare, home working, hybrid education, and the impact of work-life balance, also impacting on Police Scotland's family. Also, a failure to date to acknowledge that new COVID-19 regulations amended regarding police powers to enter premises and indoor gatherings result in an increased risk of infection and transmission to police officers and again to their families. Now, in your opening statement, Chief Constable, you referred to the three broad principles that you were looking at dealing with this emergency, and you've repeated several times to the committee that you have three overriding priorities dealing with this emergency. But it seems to me that the priority which has not been prioritised as it should be is the one that the health, safety and well-being of officers and staff and their family is protected during this pandemic. Do you agree it's hard to say that isn't an accurate assessment?
I think it's a wholly inaccurate assessment. I think right from the outset, we know that policing is a challenging job. We know that the work we've done with staff associations, with trade unions, the ability to access and to allocate full PPE at a very early stage, in many ways putting policing ahead of other sectors. My own constant communication with officers and staff and those of the people that they serve. I don't think that's a fair narration from the Scottish Police Federation. I think the concerns about transmission indoors is one that we've always recognised. And what I have always sought to do is to minimise and to mitigate risk. We've always followed the best practice we've had from Health Protection Scotland, from the Health and Safety Executive. We've been robustly challenged by the Scottish Police Federation. At times they've gone beyond our own internal processes, and when that's happened, the approach that we've taken has been shown to be thorough, has shown to be fair. So again, as I said to Ms Mackay, the concerns of those in the Scottish Police Federation Executive are absolutely held in good faith, and they raise them in a robust manner. But I personally, as Chief Constable and as the senior constable in the organisation, any suggestion that I don't take the safety and well-being of officers and staff and their family extremely seriously, I don't accept. And we will always seek to improve that when guidance changes, when practice changes from elsewhere. But the nature of policing is that we have at times to step forward into circumstances that bring a potential danger. And I acknowledge that. I'm conscious of it every single day. And that's why we'll continue to try and provide the best support and the best equipment possible. And you've seen people stepping forward, not only into private indoor dwellings, people stepping forward into situations of extreme danger. You saw that at West George Street in Glasgow at the end of June. That's what the police service does. We're there to protect our fellow citizens as Chief Constable, I will do everything I can to protect the officers and staff. When concerns are raised, I will listen to them, but I don't accept that there's been any lack of commitment on my part as Chief Constable and that of the service to the health and well-being of officers and staff. And again, I point out a number of factors of the level of commitment, the very low level of absences, and the focus that our officers and staff have brought to their duties during this difficult time.
Can I continue?
Yes, Margaret.
Thank you. That's precisely the point, Chief Constable. We're all aware, acutely aware, of the job that the police do and that they're part of the emergency services. You seem to be convinced that priority 3 has been actively and effectively prioritised. I think you've got a bit of work to do to ensure the rank and file representatives that that's the case. But you mentioned specifically PPE. Can you just confirm that response officers and other officers are not put at risk from COVID-19 when they're approaching, arresting, detaining and transporting individuals? And you've said that they all have PPE. Can you say how this PPE is sourced and what checks and balances have been carried out to ensure that it is fit for purpose?
Thank you for that. Again, I disagree that I need to convince the rank and file of my commitment to their health and safety and well-being. In terms of the movement of individuals who have to come into custody, again, as I said earlier, we can't eliminate all risk. We seek to minimise it, we mitigate it. We give our officers and staff full equipment, full COVID-19 protective equipment, that if there's any suggestion or indication, any inference at all, they are entirely free thereafter to utilise it. In addition to that, even where there is no suggestion of that, we've issued numerous thousands of surgical face masks for utilisation and protective gloves that they themselves would thereafter deploy. The equipment that was sourced is, as I said earlier, based on advice from Health Protection Scotland, advice from the Health and Safety Executive, best practice from the National Police Chiefs Council. And where there is any other advice or guidance that arises that identifies improved practice, well, then we'll look at that. We'll always look at that. Of course we will, because our health and safety officers, and again, the people within the Police Service of Scotland, not only the people at the front end who have done quite a remarkable job, but people working in health and safety, people working in procurement, again, have worked round the clock, try and obtain times quite scarce resources. I've had to account on a number of occasions to colleagues within Scottish Government and give them a reassurance that the police service was not accessing PPE for its officers and staff that should have been going to other parts of the public sector, because our arrangements and our procurement lines and the discipline and structure that we brought to bear in terms of the issuing and allocation of it was such that at times we were seen as being ahead of other areas. So I'm satisfied we've been following the best practice and the best guidance that's available, but we will always change and alter that when better practice or better guidance may emerge.
Vera?
You complete, Margaret? Yeah, okay, thank you very much indeed. Chief Constable, briefly please, because time's not on our side. When last we met, there was a very live issue connected with health and safety equipment, and that related to the safety of officers undertaking drunk driving procedure. That was referred externally. Can you give a very brief update on that, please?
Thanks, Convener. Briefly, the Health and Safety Executive looked at the practice that we followed for roadside breath testing. They looked at the equipment that was available. They looked at the operational guidance that we'd issued, and they were satisfied that we were taking all necessary steps that were required. I reported that matter to the Scottish Police Authority, reported that matter back to colleagues in the Scottish Police Federation who had raised it. Again, raised in good faith because they felt there was concern. But again, in terms of the rank and file feedback into me, I didn't have a single roads police officer raising any concerns around the process or the equipment that had been issued. Health and Safety Executive supported that, and again, it doesn't arise wholly without risk, but such is the evil and the mischief of drink driving that we need to continue to take steps to combat it, and that's what we're going to continue to do in a safe manner. And the Health and Safety Executive accepted that Police Scotland were acting in accordance with the law and also in accordance with my kind of ethical and legal duties to officers and staff.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. That was just for completeness, given it was raised at the last meeting. Thanks. Our next questions are from Fulton McGregor. Fulton, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Chief Constable. And can I just firstly say I thank you on behalf of my constituents for all the work that police have done during this time of the pandemic. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, one about Spithood and one about testing, if you don't mind. And the committee does understand that the use of Spithoods by officers has increased during the pandemic. Is that correct? Are you able to outline, even just briefly, the circumstances in which such hoods would be deployed?
Thank you, Mr McGregor. Thank you for your comments. That is appreciated. Firstly, I apologise. I think we provided incorrect data in some correspondence back to the committee clerks, which we've clarified. So I do apologise for that. In regard to Spithoods, in general terms, I've seen some of the concerns that Amnesty International have raised. That part of the reason that establishing the independent advisory group at my initiative with John Scott and then John inviting Amnesty International and other groups onto it was to provide that critical eye and to challenge us on some of our practices. What I would say about Spithoods in general is that they're not there to stop officers getting COVID. They're there to stop people spitting on them. And no member of the police service, whether a police officer or police staff, should in any way expect or tolerate being spat upon in the course of their duties. I am publicly raised real concerns about assaults, attacks on police officers and police staff, including, for that matter, verbal assaults on people working out control rooms. And I've recently launched a pledge, personal pledge on my behalf to do everything I can to minimise that. So Spithoods are available. They will be used by officers and staff using their own judgment when it's clear somebody is spitting upon them. And actually what's happened over the COVID period, at times perhaps people just being deliberately, a very small minority being deliberately aggressive and trying to frighten officers and staff. As instances of spitting have more than doubled over the COVID period. So I think inevitably the use of Spithoods would increase. What I could say though is that, I think on average, on any month, we take up to about 10,000 people into custody across the whole of Scotland. And actually the use of Spithoods on people brought in is significantly less than 1% of that. You can see from the numbers we presented. So they're not used regularly at all. But I would insist that they're available to officers and staff to use when somebody is spitting on you or threatening to spit on you and your colleagues. They're subject to robust recording through the custody system. There's also further checks and balances in terms of the use of specialist equipment. So I absolutely, recognise some of the concerns around Spithoods, but they're used very, very infrequently. And they're subject to robust monitoring. But unfortunately, we have seen quite a significant increase in people either spitting on or threatening to spit on police officers and police staff. And coming back to some of Mrs Mitchell's challenges from some of the Federation's observations, I would be neglecting my duty if I didn't allow officers and staff to have access to them when required. But they are subject to robust monitoring and used, as I said, in a tiny minority of cases.
Thank you, Chief Constable, and I think we can all I agree with your comments there that spitting on police officers or any public servant is absolutely unacceptable, and you need to take the steps that are open to you. Moving on to testing, Chief Constable, if I could ask you just a wee bit about the COVID testing. How many officers have been tested for COVID-19? Do you feel this is the right number? Are you testing? Do you need to test a bit more, or a bit less? And do you have any stats on how many officers have been absent with COVID-19? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mr. McGregor. Again, testing, has been a hot topic right across the whole of the country since the outset. And within Police Scotland, we obviously have access to the wider test and trace regime that exists. But in addition to that, we've also provided officers and staff with access even where they are asymptomatic. So if for any reason an officer or a member of police staff feel that they've had any level of contact with somebody who's either claims to have COVID or is believed to have it, but even if that police officer or member of police staff isn't showing any of the symptoms that we're all aware of, we would still provide the access to testing and hope to get those results back as quickly as we can. I think there's been, and again I can get specific figures and write to the clerks, Mr. McGregor, but in general terms I think we've had over 2,000 officers and staff tested, and the positive result from that is about 10%. I think there's about 200 individuals who have tested positive out of a workforce of about 23,000. So we're going to continue to allow the asymptomatic testing that we've introduced. If any member of staff or any police officer has any concerns, we'll provide access to that, and we'll also, where necessary, provide that support to their families.
Thank you very much. That's me, Convener.
Thank you, Fulton. Thank you, Chief Constable. Before moving on to the next questions, Chief Constable, can I take you back to Spidhoods? And I should refer to my register of interests. I am a member of Amnesty, and it was Amnesty that raised these specific concerns. You alluded to an exchange of correspondence between the clerks and Police Scotland and a difference in figures. I think it's important to point out that it was Police Scotland that drew our attention to the fact that the figures we'd been initially provided with weren't accurate. You talked about robust recording. Can you say how that's done, please, Chief Constable, briefly? And the concerns raised by Amnesty and others is about the potential for hoods to be applied to individuals who might have medical conditions, particularly respiratory problems, and what guidance is given to officers about that. Is there any plans to review this? Because no one would condone policing. It's a vile spitting. It's a vile practice, and it's right that you take robust action to it. But there are genuine concerns about the use of equipment.
Thanks, Convener. The recording of it is significant. When somebody who's been arrested is brought into police custody, as you know, there's then an independent custody sergeant supervisor who accepts the custody, and they will record any requirement or any deployment of a spit hood, the reasons for that, and the rationale, and they themselves will satisfy themselves that it's proportionate and necessary. There's also a further check and balance done in terms of the recording on a police system of when one would use some specialist equipment. So, as you'll recall, if you ever did draw your baton or used your handcuffs, that needs to be recorded independently as well. And we do similar matters with spit hoods. We are very conscious of the concerns that have been raised. I think they're legitimate. I talked earlier about the awareness of every individual being different, and every individual having different circumstances, not all of which might be visible to police officers and police staff. And we'll continue to make sure that the use of spit hoods are monitored closely, and that there's appropriate guidance in terms of the need for proportionality and necessity. But I would come back to my key point, Convener, that I would be in neglect of my ethical and moral and legal duty to the officers and staff if I didn't allow the use of spit hoods when somebody was determined to spit on somebody who was seeking to do their duty. So they're subject to robust recording. I do take on the concerns which I recognise, but we do need to have that particular piece of equipment.
Okay, thanks for that, Chief Constable. Our next questions are from Shona Robertson. Shona, please.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask about an issue that you raised in your opening remarks about some of the more vulnerable people who have been even more affected during COVID? And it's been highlighted that the imposition of restrictions may have had significant impacts on those more vulnerable people, including people with learning difficulties or those who have been victims of domestic abuse, for example. This obviously remains a significant concern and priority going forward. So can you maybe outline, say, a bit more about what steps you're taking to ensure that individuals in those circumstances are identified and, most importantly, supported?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Robertson. It was one of the challenges, particularly in the early days and weeks, where the clear message to stay at home was unequivocal, and everybody was adhering to that. But we knew, and we were very, very conscious that for some people, tragically, being at home is not a safe place to be. But we've worked very, very closely with the third sector, with Scottish Women's Aid and other support networks. We've worked very closely with colleagues in local authorities who provide crucial support and interventions. We've done a series of campaigns. We've encouraged people to be good neighbours, to look out for each other, to call the police if there was any level of concern. I was adamant around that if you had a concern about a neighbour, call the police. They'll trust us to deal with it sensitively. If it came to nothing, all well and good. But if you had a concern, raise it, because that was the best way to protect and support people who potentially may be vulnerable. The other area, as well as the domestic setting, that I touched upon in opening comments as well, is in the online setting. Society has, of necessity, had to move on to more in the online platform. More of us are having to live our lives there. And for some people, and I can think, on a personal level, I can think of my own mother in that regard, who had never done anything online, or had never done anything other than in a physical presence. Suddenly to start to try to use online banking, or to try to make contact online without necessarily having some of the security habits that a number of us have probably built up over the years. That this was a new world, and that increased a level of vulnerability. We've seen greater exploitation as young people and children were at home, and again, as we know, going online to socialise, at times not always socialising with people who they thought they would be. So again, we've done a number of online campaigns, a number of physical campaigns, and as we're now coming out of the more severe restrictions with partners, we are looking to visit people who have previously been repeat victims. We're looking to visit people who have reoffended, people who are subject to conditions, people who have a history around that, and we're encouraging people to make use of some of the disclosure schemes that arise. If you've got a concern about an individual, again, it's handled sensitively, disclosures made if appropriate. If not, there's a degree of reassurance given. So it has been challenging. I think the First Minister herself recognised that asking people to stay at home actually increased the risk that some people were exposed to, and that's been one of the examples of the challenges and the balance that's had to be struck because of this public health emergency, where people who actually required great assistance, people who would be engaging with school teachers, with social workers, with other people in the public domain, were withdrawn from that, and therefore the opportunities to make some preventive interventions were lessened. But we've been conscious from the outset, worked very, very closely with many partners in the public sector and the voluntary sector, and will continue to be a priority in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I think that's very reassuring. It would be helpful, if this is at all possible, that programme of revisiting and following up, whether there will be any information that could be gathered and fed back to this subcommittee. Obviously discretion in terms of protecting people's identity, but I think any feedback on what the findings are around that follow-up with some, particularly those who have been victims of domestic abuse, would be really helpful, I think, to us, if that's possible.
No, absolutely. Again, on follow through to your question, Ms. Robertson, I think we can do an assessment on not only in regard to domestic abuse, but also in terms of some of the child protection concerns and also some of the online concerns that I expressed, and we can provide the committee with an assessment of the experience we've had, the reports we've had, the actions, the interventions that we've taken, and some of the joint work, and maybe put a bit more meat on the bones that I've outlined this afternoon.
Thank you.
A supplementary question, Margaret Mitchell. Margaret, please.
Convener, I wonder, Chief Constable, if you could include in that a recognition and some kind of an assessment of the increase of instances of child abuse during lockdown, and specifically sexual childhood abuse. Already early indications from charitable and third sector organisations is that has been very much on the increase, which is obviously a huge matter of concern.
Absolutely, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you for that. We will include I'll look at the whole area around about public protection, which would include child vulnerability, sexual and physical assaults on children, as well as domestic abuse and other areas. But no, I'll ensure that's done, and we'll liaise with your clerks on that matter.
Thank you, Chief Constable. We're coming towards the end. A couple of questions I have here. One relates to something that you've touched on a number of occasions here, and it's perhaps the lessons that are learned from this, not only as we go along, but in the longer term, and the opportunities to embed some of that. As you said, decisions were taken quicker perhaps than they would have ordinarily. The Police Federation indicates in its written evidence that it's not aware of any proactive activity within the service to establish the impacts of changes to working practice. That might be seen as a bit early, or it maybe that should be capturing on an ongoing basis. Can you comment on that, please, and perhaps on the potential for a staff survey to get used?
Thanks. I read that comment in the Federation submission, and again, to be very candid, I was really surprised at that. The Scottish Police Federation have representatives that consistently sit on the Operation Tala Silver group in terms of the working groups we've got on operational practice, the working groups we've got on PPE. We have representatives on a convened group that I established a number of weeks ago that was established to look at lessons learned, was established to look at our ability almost to the restoration and the recovery phase, and how we would achieve that. And actually, a number of the Federation representatives, not necessarily the General Secretary himself, but a number of the Federation representatives have had significant inputs into some of these forums. And we're working with them as we develop our response. And there are some comments there that I wholeheartedly agree with about the need to look at, for example, our approach to police estate and how we work going forward. But we have made changes, as this committee has, as the society have, the way we're holding the meeting here today. So, our part of our expenditure, by way of example, that the spend we've made to purchase new PPE and other COVID-related expense, part of that has been offset by a significant reduction in travel and petrol outlay, etc., because we're making greater use of this remote process. So we absolutely do need to capture some of the changes to practice, such as remote working. It provides greater flexibility for people with caring responsibilities. It's better for the environment. It's better for people's well-being, and actually sometimes you get better decisions from it because people are less tired not having to drive, as you would know better than many, having to drive 2 or 3 hours to get to the meeting that you're required to be at. But I genuinely didn't recognise the fact that the representatives of the staff associations and the unions haven't been involved in it. They absolutely are, and a lot of the work is ongoing. We haven't got significant conclusions from that, but really right from the outset we want to make sure that some of the improvements that have come as an unintended consequence of this crisis, that we don't just revert to how business was, and we make sure that we use the business improvement practices that we've seen.
Can I ask you directly then, Chief Constable, given that this has been alluded to 2 or 3 times, how are relations? Is there a breakdown in communication between yourself and officials, perhaps, of the SPF?
No, there's never a breakdown in communications between myself and the officials of the Scottish Police Federation. I've spoken, I think, literally over the years at every hour of the day. Not at all. I mean, the Federation have a clear role to play. I'm an enormous supporter of the Scottish Police Federation. I was a member of the Scottish Police Federation. I know it sounds almost foolish to say it, but that is the case. I was a police officer in Scotland for almost 30 years. So the role the Federation has to play in challenging and bringing their experience is robust. I've got a very good personal relationship with the officials, and at times we'll have a different perspective on things, but the relationships are good.
Good. Robust challenge is good, I think, Chief Constable. Chief Constable, in the course of our meeting here, information has been relayed to me about an announcement, which clearly was for the First Minister to make rather than yourself, and it does relate to a change of powers from tomorrow, if I'm reading correctly, that powers to break up house parties of 15 or more guests. Can you comment on any concerns you may have about the resource implications of that, or indeed, the engagement with the public's response to that change, please?
Well, thanks, Convener. And again, it touched upon an earlier question about our involvement with the development of the regulations. I think I said to Mr MacArthur that I've been involved late last night, again this morning. And one of the issues in regard to the new changes that the First Minister has announced, I haven't heard the specific detail, and again, it literally can change up to the last minute. But the generality of it, I completely understand. The threat, all the public health evidence that's been presented is that transmission indoors, where groups of people from different households are gathered together, is the most significant threat, and people are taking steps in public hospitality places to minimise that. People are taking steps in retail premises through the use of masks and whatnot. but actually when people are indoors and often drinking too much, inhibitions are restricted. So the prohibition is there, and we will continue, absolutely continue, as I've said a number of times, with the approach that we had at the outset, which is always to look, to engage with people, to encourage people to do the right thing, tell people to go home. If they go home willingly, that's good. But the need to put this into regulation is one that I understand. One issue that had caused me concern, and I'm pleased to see that the Scottish Government have responded to that, was in extremis the need to actually have a power of entry to go and take steps. Now, vast majority of times that won't be needed. If we are called, we'll be able to engage with people. That's how people are overwhelmingly. But where there's outright refusal, where they know that the police service are at the door and they're refusing to let people in and they're turning the music up and they're continuing to act in that manner, we do need to go in. We have that power already under civic government in regard to loud music. So my position was, well, given the threat and given the gravity of the public health threat, that was a proportionate and legitimate power. So it has been granted with a number of parameters, as I understand, and it's one that we will use very lightly. We will use it the same way as we've done all the powers that have been granted. Enforcement will be the last resort, but it is there because it's clear from what the First Minister and others have said that the continuation of house parties remains a real threat to containing the virus.
Thank you for that, Chief Constable. With a brief supplementary from the Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell. Margaret, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd be grateful, Chief Constable, if you would again acknowledge that was in the police the SPF submission, where they anticipated this change and again pointed out that this increases the risk of infection, transferring not only to police officers but their families. And for whatever reason, they are not satisfied that this has been acknowledged to date. Will you now take that on board?
I'm not sure I read that part of the submission in that way, Mrs Mitchell, but I don't think there's been any difference between myself and the Scottish Police Federation on the dangers of house parties and the way that is transmitted. And again, I've been really keen to make sure that there's as much equipment issued to officers and staff to protect them. It will be an extra burden, again, as a convener alluded to, and we will be working with the Scottish Police Federation and others to produce operational guidance. But I've never disputed the danger from house parties. I've publicly stated that should be avoided, and now the house parties are subject to very specific regulation with enforceable powers, and I think that just underlines the gravity of the situation. So on that interpretation, I would agree with the Federation's position.
Okay, thank you, Chief Constable. I have no indications of any other requests for questions. That completes our questions and concludes our evidence session. Can I thank you for taking time to come to discuss openly with us and frankly the situation, and I'm sure members of the committee would want me to thank Police Scotland, its officers and staff for keeping our communities safe. And that concludes this section, and we now move to agenda item 3, which is
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Chief Constable. Our next item of business is a short discussion to ratify the decisions we made at our business planning meeting. For the record, the subcommittee met informally via MS Teams on Tuesday 11th August to consider its forward work programme up to the end of this year. I refer members to paper 3, which provides a note of these decisions. Do members have any points they want to make, or are they content to ratify the decisions we've already made? It seems that we're all agreed. Thank you very much for that. That now concludes the public part of today's meeting. The next meeting of the subcommittee will be on the 17th of September, when we will take evidence on the police budget for the next financial year. In the meantime, any follow-up scrutiny issues will be dealt with by correspondence, which will be published on our website. And as previously agreed, I'll now move the meeting into private session. Thank you.